Hi, this lesson is psychopathology. This is our next topic. This is in paper 1. So in paper 1 you should already have memory and social. So this is the third one that we need to put in paper 1, which is psychopathology. And we're going to look at definitions of, and that should say abnormality. So, definitions of abnormality. I'll explain what that is in a little bit, but what I want you to start off with doing is looking at these three individuals, Mrs. Jarvis, Mrs. Patel and Mr. Smith. Read their scenarios and I want you to decide who is the most normal. While you're doing this as well, you might want to think about what it means to be normal and how we would say whether somebody is normal or not. So just pause the video, read through that, who's the most normal, why, and what does normal mean. Okay, so if you look at these three people, Mrs. Jarvis, she's Jamaican, she believes in the Pentecostal church and she says that she's speaking in tongues. If we look at that we might think, that's quite strange, very abnormal, maybe she's got schizophrenia and she's hearing voices. But if we really think about it, Mrs. Jarvis is from Jamaica and she has a very specific religion. We need to investigate the religion and the culture where she's from, because it might actually be that individuals who are part of the Pentecostal church are actually believe in this and behave this way very often. They believe that they can speak to their ancestors and they believe in spirits and believe that spirits can pass through them. Next we've got Mrs. Patel. She's very afraid of heights. She's quit her job because it was too high up and she won't go and see her daughter. So if we think about Mrs. Patel, this behaviour is potentially quite abnormal. A lot of us are afraid of heights, but we don't let that impact on our everyday life. So Mrs. Patel's behaviour is actually impacting on her everyday life, and this is where the difference between a fear and a phobia happens. If you have a phobia, it tends to impact on your life in some kind of significant way. So she's left her job, which could have impacts on her lifestyle. It could be that she actually, it's not just her job now, it's starting to be anywhere that's up high, like she might not want to go up escalators and things like that. We need to investigate it further to see what impact this is having on Mrs. Patel's life, and if it's having a significant impact, we could say that this behaviour isn't very normal. And then we've got Mr. Smith. He lives in an isolated cottage, he doesn't have friends and he doesn't have visitors. If we were to give you this, I don't know, 3 months ago, you'd be like, well, that's quite abnormal because you shouldn't really be isolated and it's really important to see your family and friends. But if you think about today, his behaviour is very normal because we all have to isolate and none of us are allowed to see our family and friends. So actually today, reading that, Mr. Smith is probably the most normal out of all of them. This is important because this shows how norms can change over time. So previous, like 3 months ago, Mr. Smith's behaviour was very abnormal, well, quite abnormal. We might want to check on him, we might want to make sure that he's not depressed, we might want to make sure that he doesn't have agoraphobia and he's not afraid of going outside. But now these norms have changed and actually that's something that's quite normal. So if we think about what the word normal means, for something to be normal it has to be accepted within society. So we have social norms, and if you do sociology you'll be aware of this term. And social norms are defined by us. We decide what's normal and what isn't. They are within the context of the law, so laws can help us decide what's normal and what behaviour isn't normal. There's cultural definitions as well, so what's normal in the UK might be abnormal somewhere else. Or vice versa, so like Mrs. Jarvis's behaviour might be normal in Jamaica but abnormal in the UK. So when we're thinking about what it means for someone to be normal, we need to take into account the culture that that person's from, the laws that govern the society, and what the norms are in everyday life, what most people are behaving like. So with regards to our definitions of abnormality, I'm going to give you 2 in today's lesson and then 2 in tomorrow's. So the first one is deviation from social norms and the second one is statistical infrequency. So these are the first 2 and you've got 2 more in tomorrow's lesson. So if we're looking at deviation from social norms, you might want to pause this and make some notes. This is behaviour which is seen as antisocial, so it's something that goes against the norms of society. So you can see I've got a couple of pictures there. We've got Lady Gaga and Miley Cyrus. A lot of what they do and the ways in which they behave are deemed as abnormal because they go against what society expects. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with these individuals, but it might be that we need to investigate this a little bit. And just make sure that these people are okay. It could be that we actually need to consider the context of their behaviour. So why was Lady Gaga wearing that dress? Was it to make a statement? Was it something political, or was it something to do with the environment? Why was Miley Cyrus behaving in that way? Was it a media stunt? Was it to improve her career? Or was it something that was very, very out of the ordinary? If it's something that's very out of the ordinary and it's not expected and there's no relevant context behind their behaviour, then we might think, okay, this person's deviating from social norms, we need to look at this in a little bit more detail and make sure that they're okay. In the exam, you'll be given this scenario, like an item, and what you'll have to do is you'll have to go through that item and you'll have to decide whether that person is normal or abnormal and which definition you should use to define that. But I'll give you some exam questions at the end of the second lesson, so you can go through those and you can have a look at exactly how they would look, and I'll speak you through the mark schemes for them as well. So for deviation for social norms, we need to remember that it's some behaviour that goes against the norms in society, and these norms are governed by our laws, our culture, our religion, etc. So an example for deviation from social norms is politeness. So someone who's behaving in a particularly rude way, so they're not making eye contact, they're very abrupt, very straight to the point, you find it very difficult to interact with that person and have a conversation with that person. This is someone who's deviating from social norms, particularly in our society, in the UK. This could be an indication that that individual has something wrong with them, in terms of they might be on the autistic spectrum, or they might have Asperger's. Individuals with Asperger's in particular find conversation very difficult. They find it really hard to maintain eye contact, and they often have to practice what they would say in social situations. So if we've got someone at primary school who's very rude and abrupt, and they're not communicating with their peers, and they're not making eye contact with their peers or their teachers, this would be a warning sign, and this individual, we would say, they're deviating from social norms, because normally young children interact with each other, have conversations with each other, they make friends, they make eye contact with each other, and we'd have a look at that individual in a little bit more detail to see if they needed to be diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum or having Asperger's. In evaluation, so you might want to pause it and make some notes on this, there's three things that we need to consider: time, context and culture. So you'll see that social norms change over time, so what is seen as normal in one period of time might be abnormal in a current period of time, or vice versa. So the example here is homosexuality. 50 years ago this was a deviant behaviour, you would be arrested for this behaviour, you would be given medical treatment or psychological treatment for this behaviour, but in modern day society this behaviour is absolutely fine, and it's normal, it's a part of our society now, and we celebrate this behaviour. So social norms can change over time, and when we're diagnosing an individual, we need to make sure we're taking into account the time period that that person has lived in, and link that to their behaviour, and kind of think, okay, so they're a little bit older than back in the time when they were growing up, this was what was normal in society, so we can see why this person is behaving in this way now. So we need to take that into account. Cultural relativism, so this is the idea that we need to make sure that we take into account an individual's culture. Some deviation from social norms previously, when this definition was used, they didn't take into account an individual's cultural background. But now when this definition is used, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is used by psychiatrists to diagnose individuals, now they include a questionnaire which takes into account someone's cultural background. So Mrs. Smith, was it, from earlier, if we were diagnosing her, we would give her a questionnaire, we would ask her about her cultural background, and we would find out about the Pentecostal church and the beliefs of the church, and we would help that. We would use that to help us make a decision as to whether her behaviour was normal or abnormal. Another example that relates to that is the Day of the Dead in Mexico. So in Mexico, on the Day of the Dead, they put offerings around their ancestors' graves and put pictures up, and they remember them, and they dance and they sing, and it's a big celebration. If that behaviour was happening in Mexico on the Day of the Dead, you'd be like, yep, that's absolutely fine. If, however, that was happening in Waltham Cemetery on a random Tuesday night, you'd be like, okay, we need to really look at this person and make sure that they're okay. But if we found out that that person originated from Mexico and they were coming to visit their relatives and it was that time of year, then we would be like, okay, they're fine. The final one is context. So what we need to do is we need to think about the context of the behaviour. So if we think about, go back to like Lady Gaga wearing that dress, we put that behaviour into context, and she was making a statement, and I can't remember what it was something environmental or something political, then we know why she was wearing it, and we understand that, yes, it's a bit of an extreme way to get your point across, but there was a reasoning behind that behaviour. If, however, there was no reasoning behind that behaviour, no political or environmental message, and she just wanted to wear it because she thought it'd be nice and comfortable, then we would be like, okay, there's a bit of a problem here. You're really deviating from social norms and the context doesn't fit, so we need to investigate this further. So when we're evaluating deviation from social norms, we need to make sure when we're using this definition, we take into account the time in which the behaviour occurred, the culture which the individual is from, and the DSM now does that because it has a questionnaire for that. And we also need to make sure we take into account the context of the behaviour, so the reasoning behind that behaviour. Our next definition is statistical infrequency. So this is behaviour that's rare and it's found in very few people. And if it's found in very few people, we would define this behaviour as being abnormal. So you can see there's a graph, and this is a graph of IQ. So you can see it's a normal distribution curve, where you've got the most people in the middle with an IQ of 100, and then you can see if we go down, so each marker at the bottom is what am I trying to say? Each marker shows how far away they are from the middle point, okay? Standard deviation, that's the one. So if someone is, say, like 2 standard deviations from the mean, then we might say like 2 standard deviations this way. So maybe if their IQ is between 70 and 55, we would say that person's behaviour is rare, or it's less common, so we need to investigate that. And if we investigate that, so we did an IQ test with children in year 2, and we found out that some of them had a really, really low IQ, so maybe 2 of them had a very low IQ, we might investigate that further because we might find out that they actually have learning difficulties. It works the other way as well, so you can see like Albert Einstein and Mozart had an IQ of 160, so that IQ is extremely rare, and it's 3 standard deviations away from the mean. So you can see that that behaviour is very, very rare, very, very uncommon, so we would see those individuals as being abnormal. And this is where this definition is quite difficult, because sometimes abnormal behaviour is actually really desirable, so sometimes we really want to have a high IQ, and we wouldn't necessarily say like Einstein was an abnormal individual because his genius is something that lots of people desire. But it could be an indication that someone is autistic, if they have a really, really high IQ. But then if we combine statistical infrequency with something else, so we find out someone's got a really high IQ, we start to investigate that, and then we actually combine that with deviation from social norms, and we find out that that person finds it difficult to communicate with their peers, then actually we might decide that this person belongs on the autistic spectrum, and we can decide where that is. So an example, so statistical infrequency is a behaviour that is rare or less common. So we find out if someone's got a behaviour that's rare, so it's usually 2 or more standard deviations from the mean, either below or above, then we would see that this person, we would start to investigate that person, and we might decide that they have some kind of abnormality. An example here is an extreme phobia. Extreme phobias, like Mrs. Patel, are very rare and uncommon. An example here is Johnny Depp. He's got a fear of clowns, which I can't remember what that is called. It says there, chlorophobia. So you can see that his fear is very extreme. Like Mrs. Patel's fear of heights is starting to get very, very extreme, and to have a very extreme fear like that is very rare. It's not as common. Most people are afraid of heights, but not many of them would let that fear affect their lives. They wouldn't start to leave their jobs, etc., because of their fear. So you might want to stop now and write some evaluation points for statistical infrequency. So we've got this idea that some abnormal behaviour is desirable, so sometimes it's not the best definition to use, like IQ. It's not always the best definition to use, because if someone's got a really high IQ, then we don't see that as being abnormal, we see that as being something that is desirable. Next, the idea that the cut-off point is subjective, so what someone decides is abnormal, or how many standard deviations from the mean that is something that's subjective, and that's to do with the person that's diagnosing the individual. So if their experience, say we're looking at depression and we're giving someone a questionnaire on depression, if that therapist or that psychiatrist decides that if you get 8 to 10, then we're going to diagnose you with depression, but actually it might be that you get a 6 or a 7 and you're still suffering from depression, but that individual has decided to push the marker and the boundary a bit higher. So it's quite subjective, and it's really hard to say how far away from normal is abnormal, if that makes sense. And finally, sometimes statistical infrequency is the most appropriate method. It's a really good indication of someone who's an outlier, and if we find out that they're an outlier, then yeah, it might be that they have a really IQ and they're absolutely fine and normal and they're just like a child genius, but it could be that someone has a really high IQ, and we can use this as we can use a second measure then, and we can think like, right, they've got a really high IQ, which is quite abnormal even though it's desirable. Let's just check and see, do they deviate from social norms? Okay, how are they doing in everyday life? And ask us these questions, and when we find out the answer to these questions, we can decide whether that person is normal or abnormal. So even though sometimes it's the most appropriate method to use, it's a really quick, a really easy measure, sometimes it's good because it can be used as like an initial indication. So like you do the depression questionnaire, you get a really high score. This is a really good initial indicator that something might be happening, like there might be an underlying problem here. And then what we can do is we can ask other questions, okay? The questions for depression would relate to failure to function adequately, which is a definition that we'll look at in tomorrow's lesson. So we can combine those two to find out if someone is really abnormal or if they're doing okay. So it's important to remember when we're evaluating statistical infrequency that some infrequent behaviour is desirable. The cut-off point is subjective. It's often a really appropriate measure to use, and it's a good initial indicator, because we can use it with other definitions to help us decide whether someone is normal or abnormal and if they need our help. Okay, so I would like you to now complete the quiz. If you have any questions, please put comments below or add a private comment, and we'll discuss the other two definitions in tomorrow's lesson. Thank you.